On a farm near Leon, Wisconsin, on March 1, 1924, Donald Kent Slayton was born to Charles Sherman and Victoria Adelia Slayton. Being raised in rural Wisconsin, the family home did not have electricity or indoor plumbing. Young Slayton worked at the farm raising cows and sheep along with growing tobacco. As a child, he attended a small two-room elementary schoolhouse in Leon, and later graduated from Sparta High School in 1942. With World War II already in progress, young Slayton joined the U.S. Army Air Force and entered the Aviation Cadet Training Program in San Antonio, Texas. He began his flight training at the Training Center in Vernon and Waco, Texas. Despite his desire to fly single-engine fighters, he was assigned to fly multi-engine aircraft, and was assigned to the 340th Bombardment Group. The Bomber Group, comprised of B-25 bombers, flew combat missions over the Balkan Peninsula. At first, he was assigned as a co-pilot, but was quickly promoted to pilot, and after 56 sorties, Slayton had completed his combat tour and was returned to the United States in May of 1944. He was stationed at Columbia Army Air Base to train pilots on the B-25 bomber. While there, he applied and was accepted to fly the new A-26 bomber and was assigned to the 391st Bombardment Group. He flew 7 combat missions over Japan. His final mission was flown on August 12, 3 days after the bombing of Nagasaki. After the war, he served as a B-25 instructor and decided to leave the service in November of 1946. Slayton decided to take advantage of the GI Bill and enrolled at the University of Minnesota to study aeronautical engineering. He graduated from the university in 1949 with a Bachelor of Science degree. That same year, he went to work at the Boeing Aircraft Corporation in Seattle as a junior design engineer. While there, he worked on several projects including the B-52 Stratofortress and the KC-97 Stratofreighter. During his time in college, he had joined the Minnesota Air National Guard, where he got to fly the P-51 Mustang. After leaving Boeing in 1951, Slayton joined the Air Force Reserve, and in 1952 he was transferred to active duty in the United States Air Force and was stationed at the Wiesbaden Army Airfield of the 12th Air Force, headquartered in West Germany. While stationed there, he applied for, and was accepted, to the Air Force Test Pilot School. And upon graduation in 1955, he was assigned as a test pilot to the Flight Test Center at Edwards Air Force Base, during which time he flew the F-102, as well as the F-104 and the F-105, along with the F-106. During his flights, he tested the aircraft's stall and spin characteristics as well as test firing of the Matador and Genie missiles. While at Edwards, there was another pilot who also was named Donald, so to avoid confusion, Slayton began to be referred to as DK, which eventually became his nickname, Deke. In January of 1959, Deke Slayton was selected as one of the original 7 NASA Mercury astronauts of the U.S. space program. After his physical and psychological examinations, on April 2, 1959, he was selected as one of America's new astronauts. The Slaytons left Edwards and moved to Fort Eustis. Among their neighbors were fellow newly christened astronauts, Wally Schirra and Gus Grissom. Once at NASA, due to his engineering abilities, he was assigned to the Atlas Missile Conversion Program, which was being engineered into a booster rocket to place the Mercury space capsule into orbit. The Mercury program was the United States' first venture in placing a man in space. On September 13, 1961, Mercury Atlas 4 was launched from Cape Canaveral. The unmanned mission was the first Mercury space capsule to attain orbit. During the mission, Slayton was stationed at the Orbital Tracking Facility in Bermuda. The mission proved to be a successful test of the Mercury Space Flight Network, enabling NASA to track the spacecraft throughout its orbit. After completing one orbit, the Mercury capsule safely returned to Earth, splashing down in the Atlantic Ocean. Earlier that year, the space race between the United States and the Soviet Union was in full gear, racing to be the first nation to put a man in space. Then on April 1, 1961, the Soviet cosmonaut, Yuri Gagarin became the first person to be launched into space. His Vostok spacecraft successfully returned to Earth after one orbit. 23 days later, on May 5, Alan Shepard became the first American in space. His Redstone rocket propelled his Mercury space capsule, Freedom 7, for a 15-minute suborbital flight. Then on July 21, 1961, Gus Grissom and his Mercury capsule named the Liberty Bell 7, completed the second suborbital flight, paving the way for John Glenn to make the first manned orbital flights aboard his Friendship 7 Mercury capsule, which was launched atop an Atlas D booster from Cape Canaveral on February 20, 1962. Deke Slayton was scheduled to follow John Glenn for the second orbital mission, but it was not to be. Back in 1959, during his centrifuge training, the electrocardiogram recorded erratic heart activity during the test. The medical evaluation diagnosis concluded that he had idiopathic atrial fibrillation, which can cause an irregular and rapid heartbeat. But the condition at that time was not considered serious, and he was cleared for spaceflight. Just 2 months prior to Deke's scheduled flight aboard his Delta 7 Mercury capsule, the NASA administrator, James Webb, after reviewing Deke's heart disorder, decided that Slayton would be medically disqualified and grounded him from flying any of the remaining Mercury missions. NASA decided to go with Gordon Cooper for the second orbital flight. And on May 15, 1963, he and his Faith 7 spacecraft lifted off from Cape Canaveral. This was to be the last of the Mercury missions. After completing 22 orbits around the Earth, he splashed down 4 miles from the recovery ship, the aircraft carrier, the USS Kearsarge. After being grounded, Slayton was selected as the senior manager of the astronaut office. His new duties included selecting the next set of astronauts to man the new Gemini program. He later was promoted to Director of Flight Crew Operations, where he oversaw selecting the crews for the Gemini and Apollo moon missions. Slayton was determined to return to flight status. Along with exercise and medication, his condition improved. In 1971, he was examined by the doctors of the Mayo Clinic, who determined he no longer had a coronary condition. Then on March 13, 1972, he was returned to flight status. In 1973, he was assigned to the joint space flight mission between the Americans and the Soviet Union. After 2 years of training, both nations launched their spacecraft on July 15, 1975. The US Apollo and the Soviet Soyuz were to meet and dock together in space. Slayton piloted the Apollo spacecraft and docked in space with the Soyuz. Once the hatch between the ships was opened, the first international handshake in space took place. The two ships remained connected for 2 days, during which time they exchanged flags and gifts as well as conducted joint experiments. Slayton later on, in 1977, went on to aid in the crew selections for the early Space Shuttle missions. In 1980 he decided to retire but continued to serve in an advisory role for the shuttle missions. Deke Slayton formally left NASA on February 27, 1982. He went on to serve as president of Space Services, a Houston-based company founded to develop rockets designed for use in the placement of small commercial payloads in Earth orbit. The company successfully launched their first Conestoga rocket on September 9, 1982. It was the first privately funded rocket to reach outer space. Just 11 years later, on June 13, 1993, Deke Slayton passed away at the age of 69 from a malignant brain tumor. His ashes were scattered over his family farm in Wisconsin. He should be remembered for his dedication and contributions throughout the Mercury and Gemini programs, the Apollo moon missions, and the Space Shuttle, which were proven to be invaluable to the United States space program.